Hello. Hello, hello, hello. It's been a while. Today we're going to adventure in 2.8, look at some of the changes, and walk you through the pipeline of getting your animations to work in 2.8 over to TMTK. There's a slight difference between the binary export for 2.8 versus 2.79. And if you take a look, if you're familiar with ACSII exportation, they work in a very similar way. Okay, so to streamline things, first we're going to set our viewpoint in this direction, where the Y is facing that way. Next, I'm going to go into my preferences here. And make sure I have a few things turned on. Okay, that's on. Alright, so this right here, this VUR, this is going to show you all the shortcuts and mouse movements that I make, and that will be broadcasted right here in the corner. For anybody that wants a screencast like that, I will post in the video's description where to find that if you guys plan on doing tutorials, because that'll be very helpful for anyone who wants to follow along. Making sure Cycles Render Engine is turned on, because we're going to switch out of Eevee into Cycles Render, because Eevee was created after the TMTK was dispensed to the public, so we want to work in cycles to streamline our modeling aspect. We want to make sure UV layout is turned on, and all of these, because that will also streamline your FBX format is the format we'll be exporting into, so we want that to be checked. We don't really care about this motion capture. You can have it turned on if you want to render things in the Eevee engine, but we're going to be working in cycles, so we don't really need that either. I'm going to click down here and save my preferences and turn that off. And up here is a sidebar for it. And I'm going to start that so you can see. So this is my mouse. So when I click, you can see those highlight. Oop. And any shortcut keys I use. One of the first things I'm going to do is select this light here and delete it. You could do it that way by selecting it in your scene and right click to delete, or you can grab it in your 3D view and hit delete. 2.79 you would push X to delete things, and 2.8 you just use the delete key. I'm going to show you how to use your normals in 2.8, so instead of starting with a cube, we're going to start with a cylinder. So we're going to go ahead and just delete this starter box. We're going to go into modeling. Now here's a quick tip that you should know is every single one of these buttons up here is going to change to default settings. So as you're clicking to each one of these, you're going to have to change your viewport settings each time. So to do that, we'll go in here and we'll go view. And this is our clipping right here. Right now it's set to 1,000 meters. I want to change this to 50 meters. Because I do want some clipping. I don't want to render that far away. And in object mode, we're going to add mesh cylinder. And down here, and add cylinder, I'm going to open this up. I'm going to change this to 16. That's how many faces around. I'm going to keep the radius. Well, the depth, I'm going to keep it at 2 meters, but I'm going to change my radius to 50 centimeters. So it looks like that, like a column. And then, since it's spawned in the middle, and in the TMTK, if you have align to surface checked, then you want the object to snap to the ground. So to do that, we need the bottom to be on the ground. So right here in location, under the Z axis, I want to change this to 1 meter, so it'll bring it up. And then right click to apply it. So now the object is where we need it to be. We're going to select the object. We're going to change its name. We could, well, it's pretty much just going to be a cylinder, so we're just going to leave it cylinder, but we're going to add underscore L0, because that's going to be our first level of detail. Then we're going to go up here to object. Well, okay, so since we're in the view mode, we can see that our 3D cursor is at 0, 0, 0, 0, which is where we want it to be. So when we do this, object, set origin to 3D cursor, it'll snap that origin down there. So if you have a line to ground applied in TMTK, or I should say in Planet Coaster, then where that origin is will snap to the ground. And since the grid is representing the ground, we want it to snap to the surface of the ground. So now we're going to go over here, and we're going to make sure that our units are the right size. 0.01 metric. And we're going to go to here, and render engine, we're going to change this to cycles. Because TMTK is based off of the cycles engine for doing your UV mapping and texturing, so you'll want to use cycles. However, if you want to experiment, you could play with the EV engine, but they work very similar. But to smooth line things and to not run into any errors when you're uploading, you should switch that to cycles. But that preference is totally up to you. You don't have to, but that's just what I do because I don't want to run into problems down the line. Okay, so now I'm going to switch over to edit mode. Okay, so one key factor when you're editing normals between 2.79 and 2.8 is for editing normals, you have to be in edit mode. In 2.79, you could still view your normals applied to your object in object mode, but in 2.8 you can no longer do that. You can only see your normals applied in edit mode. And then, well, to understand what I'm talking about here, I'll just show you. Up here, where this little arrow is, you want to go into the one that looks like the 2 circles and turn on your normals, which are down here. This is a direct face normal, this is an edge normal, and this is a vertice normal. For the most part, you're going to be playing with your face normals. And those look a bit small, so when you're in here, you change how big they appear. Right there. Okay, so now, instead of constantly looking up here and clicking different things to smooth and harden edges, what we need to do is create a quick launch to get to our normals. So we're going to go view, sorry, mesh normals, which this one is Alt N, but to simplify this, we're just going to right click on this and see where it says add to quick favorites. We're going to do that. So now every time we want to manipulate our normals, we just push the Q key. And here's our normals menu. So you can flip, recalculate outside, recalculate inside, set from face, rotate, point to target, merge, split, average if you want to. Copy vectors, and then strength. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab this edge. Whoop. Right here, then Shift Alt and grab the loop. Go edge. And mark sharp. And then do the same thing down here. And then go into face mode. Grab these two faces. Shade those flat. Go invisible mode. Push A to deselect. Box tool B. And then select these. And face. Shade smooth. And A. Make that visible again. Then check the work in object mode. So we don't have any lines on the model. And the shading looks weird right now, so we're going to go over here to vertex groups. We're going to normals, turn on auto smooth, and change this to 45. So now our smoothing groups are correct. Now, a thing to note about the grid is currently, as you could tell, our model is super small because each one of these boxes right here represents 1 meter. So in object mode, we want to go into view. Everything is snapped to 0. So when we scale this, it'll snap from the ground upward. So make sure your 3D cursor is zeroed out before you do this step. And then go into item to see your transforms. But you can also see your individual items in your scenes transforms right here. And if you have multiple objects, you can change them here. And that'll be important when we go through the aspect of looking at how to get animations to work in TMTK for 2.8, because you'll want to be able to see the rotation on your armature versus the rotation on your individual meshes to make sure that the meshes are zeroed out, but the armature is not. So for now, we're going to push S for scale and pull it up to make it bigger. And then before we apply that size down here in resize, we're going to change this to 50 centimeters and make it proportional editing. Actually, I'll just turn that off for now. apply this, just click outside, and now it's applied. Okay, so in object mode, we're going to go Object, Transforms. Object, Apply, All Transforms. Now in 2.79, you had to do rotation and scale first and then location. In 2.8, they added all transforms. For the mesh itself, all transforms is fine. For the armature, you're going to want to do location and scale, but not rotation at the end. And I'll explain why when we get to that part. So, to streamline things, we want to make sure that our mesh itself is zeroed out and the scale is set to 1. Alright, UV editing. I'm just going to push A, and we can see that it's already pre-UV'd for us. I'm okay with that for this tutorial. I'm not going to go into details about UV editing and how to do that in 2.8. I can show you that in a later tutorial. And there's lots and lots of other tutorials on YouTube that show you how to UV edit within 2.8. So for this simple tutorial, we just want to get our animation to work in TMTK. So I'm okay with this UV as it is. And see, as I switch back to modeling, my clipping is changed again, so I'm going to have to go and tweak it so I can actually see what's going on. But I have my normals checked, and my normals are good. Alright, so now we want to animate this thing. You can use the animation tab, but there's something that you need to pay attention to when if you're using this animation tab. You can animate from your layout tab, but if you want to use your animation tab, I'll explain what we're looking at here. So since Blender 2.8 uses the Eevee engine, this is your general viewport right here with your grid, and this one over here is the render view. So if you were in Eevee instead of cycles, then what you're rendering would be shown over here. And then this is your timeline based off of a dope sheet. Well, for TMTK animation to work, you can't use the dope sheet. You want to be in the timeline. If you don't use the timeline, then you will have problems with exporting. So make sure you are in the timeline and not the dope sheet. We don't want to do any dope editing for animation in TMTK. It's timeline specific. So there are two ways that you can animate. One, you can use your hotkeys I to apply your rotations and locations here in the item menu. Or with this and the item selected that you're working on, you could do it here. You want to use XYZ Euler if the object is being rotated from on the Z-axis like this. If the object is being rotated on the Y-axis in, say, this direction, then you're going to want to change it to YXZ. If it's rotating on the X-axis, then you want to change this to ZYX. And that's to prevent gimbal locking, where, well, I should say it's to induce gimbal locking, if that makes sense. In other words, you only, like this object, you'll probably only want it to rotate either left or right, or forward or backwards, but you don't want it to rotate like spinning. So with this XYZ, it will rotate this way, that way, and that way, but it won't spin around on the Z axis because it's XYZ. But if you were to change it to YXZ or YZX, then it will rotate up and down and on the x-axis, but it won't rotate on the y. So when you're animating, there is tutorials out there that explains the different gimbal locks on the E-Eulers, and I would highly recommend looking into that if you want to do more advanced animation. So then that way you can manipulate your mesh without running into gimbal lock, or you can't rotate a certain way because of the way that you have your E-Euler set up. Alright, so we're going to get into the fun part. Okay, so I don't really need to view this render window, so I'm just going to turn it off. On my timeline. Perfect. And now I need to add an armature. So object, add armature. Now switch this to wireframe so I can see it. It's super tiny right there. So we're going to push S and bring it up. I'm going to make this match the size of the cylinder. So when I do my automatic enveloping, it will grab every vertice and apply it to this bone. I'm not going to add a node bone because I don't need it for this object because I only have one bone, so my one bone is the node. Now we're going to make sure that this is 100. If you accidentally clicked past that thing, you can always go in here to scale and fix that. Okay, object, apply. So this is the actual scale that I'm going to have my bone, so I'm going to apply its scale now. It's important before you start animating that your mesh, its transforms and scale are applied, and the armature, by default, its scale and transformations here are defaulted to 0 and 1. So now when I select my mesh and push shift to select my armature, and then I push Control P, I want to with automatic weights. I'll click out of that. Now with the mesh selected, I'm going to go into weight paint. And switch that to smoothing group so I can see that the weight has been applied to the model. I don't have any shading, but if you have multicolors, remember that TMTK doesn't support mixed weights, so you're going to want to normalize all, and then that'll switch it to dark blue for no weight applied and bright red for weight applied. And since this is a simple object, I don't have to do anything else, but TMTK supports 4 weights applied to 1 vertex, so you can limit your total here if you want to. And then you would change this to between 1 and 4, depending on how smooth you want your weights to be. So now when I look at my scene selection here, I should see that my armature is on the top and my mesh is below it. And if I go over here at my modifiers, I see that it has been applied. Alright, so all we're going to do is a simple 90-degree rotation, which is, it's going to go from this to down. So, with it on the number 1 spot, okay, it's not going to take 250 frames to make this animation. I'm going to use 180. And starting with 1, I'm going to scroll over, well, I'm going to change back to object mode. And for location, I'm going to push I, so it turns yellow. Rotation, I'm going to push I. And now I have keyframes set. And I'm going to do the same thing over here at 180, so it brings it back. And then in the middle, at 90 frames, that would be the direct middle, I'm going to change my x-axis to 90. Push enter. I already failed. Let's erase all of that. Because what we did there is called mesh morphing animation, which is where you're animating based off of the mesh, and we need to go to bone animation, so we need to be in pose mode. And we want to change this quadro rotation to XYZ Euler because we want to rotate like left and right and forward and backwards. Now that we're in pose mode and we're going to be animating the bone with the bone selected in blue, and if you want to be able to see it, you can, there you go. Okay, so I bring this over to 180, and bring this back to 90, change the X rotation to 90, and then it's orange because it hasn't been applied yet, so if you push I, then it will apply it. And there you go. Now if we push this one to go back to the start, and we push play, this should go down and then back up. And then pause, go back to the beginning, and there we go. There's a basic animation. Okay, so back into layout. If you want to get rid of this menu so you can't see it, you push in. And if you want to bring it back, push in again. If you want this one to disappear and go back on any menu, you just push T. And then if you want, instead of going up here to switch your renders, you can do that here by pushing the Z key or Z. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is duplicate this object. Now, the difference between duplicate objects and duplicate linked is duplicate objects just duplicates the object. It's separately, so if you want to manipulate everything together, you're going to have to select everything in the scene to do that. But duplicate linked, what that does is whatever you do to the first object that you are copying to duplicate will be applied to everything else. So if you're doing animation and you want all of your LODs to do the same thing when you manipulate, say, this mesh LO, then it will apply that change to every single one of them. Alright, now we're just going to rename these in numerical order. LO all the way to L5. Now from this point you would go in and modify each one of these to be lower and lower in vertices, edges, and polygons. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're just trying to get this object into the game and working with our animation. So I'm not going to show how that's done. In a later tutorial, I'll go over optimizing tricks. But I don't need to do that for right now. There's plenty of tutorials on YouTube that walk you through how to optimize level of detail meshes. And this particular object is very basic and it doesn't have that many polygons to begin with. Because we're using smoothing groups, we reduce the amount of polygons that we need all the way around to make the object look smooth by tricking the eyes and using shading within the vis groups. So, to get the object to animate correctly in TMTK, and I should say work, because if you don't do this then it won't work, so you want to select the armature itself and push R and then X and then -90, and as you can see the mesh followed, and that's fine, because if you go over to this and you see armature has a rotation on X of -90, but when you select the mesh itself, see how it's zeroed out? That's what you want. The mesh needs to stay at 0, because when it's applied to the uploader, the TMTK compiler will see the mesh being vertical, and it will see the armature at -90 on the rotation X, and when it's doing its compile checks, it will actually rotate this armature on its own back to the 0 position. So when it spits out the object, it'll animate correctly. However, the object in game will be sideways like this, so yourself and your users are going to have to rotate it back 90 degrees. There's nothing you can do about that. It's just the way that the architecture of Blender 2.8 is. However, what you do need to do is make sure that your hit check is normal, meaning it's on the ground position. So we're going to go ahead and add mesh cylinder. And the reason why we're doing this is because we don't want this new cylinder to be part of the animation. It needs to be separate because this is how you select the object in game. You need a hit check. So I'm going to change this to hit check underscore 01. And that's your physics box. And see, it's super tiny right now. And you want to make these as cheap as possible. So since it's a round object, 8 or 6 is a good number to work with. For radius, we want to make it the same as our original object. So it should be 1. Oop. I think we use 50 centimeters at the start, so yeah. Depth, I think, was 2 meters. And we changed it to 1 at some point. For cap fill, you want to change Nygon to triangle fan. You can use Nygons on your general geometry meshes, but you don't want to use that on your fizz box. TMTK does support Nygons for your physical mesh, but it doesn't support it for your fizz box, so you'll want to change that to a triangular fan for the fizz box. And that's because the way that the physics engine works is it bases its physics off of your vertices. It doesn't do it by the faces or the edges, it strictly does it by your vertices. So, in other tutorials that I've created, I've showed you how to make small objects, manipulating the compiler to think that your object is bigger by manipulating verticals. So, understanding how the physics works in TMTK will help you make small objects work. Okay, so that radius still looks a little too big, so we're going to change this to 0.25. And now it's the right size, and location on the Z-axis was 1M. 0.50. Alright, now it's in the right place. So that's our hit check. And that's how it should be positioned. And the only problem with this currently is the origin's in the wrong spot. Because if we were to leave this like this, when it is applied in game, then this hit check would actually be in the ground, because that's where the origin is. So select your hit check. And because we manipulated the mesh, it didn't apply the name change, so and object set origin, go into your view 3D cursor, everything's zeroed out, so that means that our origin will snap where it's supposed to be. So set origin to 3D cursor. And then object, apply, all transforms. And then item mode, make sure that everything is 0 and 1, which it is. So, now, going back over here to the box, and then here we look at the hit check, and it's zeroed out like it should be. We can look at the LOs and make sure that they're zeroed out like they're supposed to be. And we can look at our armature and see that there's a rotation of minus 90 degrees on the x-axis. If you do go back and select your meshes and go Object, Apply. If you already have an animation and you already have your armature at -90, then when you do apply, make sure you're only applying the location and the scale and leaving the rotation alone. Do not apply that rotation, because if you do, it will not work. So then at that point, you want to grab your hit check, shift, and hold every single one of your LOs and your armature, so everything is selected. Then go File, Save As. One thing I forgot to do was add a material. Make sure you add a material, because if you don't add a material, then you won't have a texture applied to your object. So, I already made a box prior. I think I used caps on that name, so check real quick. Yep, okay. So for this, the standard UV layout is a full box, so I'm calling it box, even though the object isn't a box. I'm just going to use that same texture for this model, so I'm going to call mine my material box. Now if you wanted to view the like right now, you can't see the texture applied to the object, but if you click this one for shading, and then over here in your material editor for base color, click this one, this little dot, and switch this to image texture, and then using the envelope here, you can load in a texture to look at on your model. And if you push A to get rid of the orange, you can see your texture applied to the object. And because 2.8 only uses binary, you don't have to worry about removing textures from the object before exporting, because it won't affect the model in any way. Like in 2.79, when you're using ASCII exportation, you had to make sure that you removed any and all texture information from your scene before you could export, or it wouldn't work in game. Well, since you're using binary, you can have texture information in the scene, and that won't affect your model at all in game. So, just a nice, cleaner workflow. Alright, so bring this down so we can see our scene. Make sure that's the hierarchy is so you can actually select everything. And again, select your hit check first, then select all of these. And then File, save it again, and then File, Export, FBX. It's a cylinder, so I'm calling it cylinder, or CIL, abbreviation. We're going to use the same settings as what we know with 2.79, which is leave the for okay. So the architecture in 2.8 is different than 2.79. So the scale you want to leave at 1, because if you change this to 0.01 to affect your normals, then that will actually make the object super tiny. So in 2.79 you would change this, but in 2.8 we're going to leave this at 1, because this is one scale unit based off of what we put inside of Blender as our units. So our metric unit was 0.01, so we're going to leave it at a 1.0 radio. Otherwise, if we were to change this, it would make it smaller in millimeters, and we don't want to do that. So -Z forward, Y up. Because this is an animation, do not check that one. And because we selected our objects, we're going to pick select objects. If you were doing a scene where it was overly complicated with all these different parts and pieces, and you only wanted to export a part of the project, then that's what selected objects is useful for. But our particular scene, we don't have any extra bits, so we could leave that unchecked, and with nothing selected, it would take everything from the scene and export it. But because we selected things, we're going to do selected objects. So with these settings like this, and we only have one bone, so we don't need to do anything in here. If we had the maximum of 18 bones, then in Armatures you'd want to uncheck add leaf bones, because what that does is that adds extra bones to your scene during the export, and that would cause a too many bones error. So we only have one bone, so we can just leave that how it is. But yeah, this is your settings. So let's go ahead and export that FBX. Moments. Alright. So I've already made my textures, and this is just general shading, nothing special about it. We just want it to look matty. So for that, we have our base texture. We want to change its color, so we have one flexi color. And then we have a dark metalness and a light roughness map, and that gives us a general matty shading on our object. So you would select... Oh. I'm going to take this file and move it out of the way for right now. You would want to create an icon, but I made this generic one because this is a test object, and a good radio is 100 by 100 or less, nothing bigger than that, for your icon PNG. And like I said, this one's just a generic drawing that I made because I wanted it to stick out within my game. Because I have a lot of TMTK objects loaded into my game, and to find my object faster, I created this crappy icon. But normally what you would do is either use the camera and snap a picture of your object, or you could use like what the hell is it called? An image capture for like desktop screenshot, and capture it that way, and then make your icon based off of that. In my Discord server, I have a link to a script that makes it so you can resize all of these all at the same time just by clicking on it and clicking resize pictures. And when you do that, you can customize the selected size in the advanced options of this script. So all of mine are set up to be multiples of 2 of 16, so 32 being the smallest image I can use in TMTK to 1024 being the maximum size I'd want to use. I mean, I could use a 2048 to make a highly detailed, high resolution object, but I don't want. The thing about TMTK objects is, while you intend to have maybe like build a immaculate statue, and that's really only intended to be used once in the park, the general user base will overuse those anyways, even though that's not its original intent. So I try not to use the full 2024 on any object for that purpose, because then what'll happen is they'll start spamming your workshop and saying your object lags or that the file size is too big. And they're not wrong, but they're not right either, and that's because they don't understand when and when not you're supposed, when and, like, unless you verify in your description, hey, this object is only intended to be used once in the level, then your users are going to complain. So that's why I typically don't use anything bigger than 1024, is because sometimes I forget. Well, I should say mostly I forget to write in that information in my workshop, and I don't want my users to come back complaining that my object causes them lag because it's too big or blah blah blah. It's like, okay, if you don't want to use the object, don't download it. Simple. I mean, quit with the complaining. But yeah, usually solid flexi objects you can get away with using a 32 by 32 because the object itself doesn't have any details, so there really isn't any point in using a large file size for your texture. You can get away with a repetitive 32 by 32 and it'll come out just fine. Anyways, that's just a nifty script to have. I'm getting distracted here. Anyway, so we got our base color, our flexi, so we could change the base color, which the base color you want to make that Obedo, which means it doesn't have any shading applied to it. It should be all grayscale, so no blacks and no solid whites. This particular one was made for a light bulb that used alpha blending, so that's why there's a white area, and that's because those areas weren't being flexi colored. But for this object, I'm just trying to get it in game, so I don't really care what the texture looks like. I just need a basic texture that'll apply to the object. So for this one, I'm just using a small. This one's a 128 all the way across the board. So it's small, so it won't take that long to compile in the TMTK online compiler. So I would select all of these, and this one, and my icon. Or, wait, this is a box. I don't want the box. I want the cylinder that I just made animate. And then with those objects selected, I would send to zip. And then once I've gone into the TMTK compiler online, then my object will animate in the game. So just a key thing to remember is for objects to animate for 2.8, your hit check needs to be, change this back to object mode. Your hit check needs to be set up like this, with the origin point right there on the ground, in the middle of where the object would be, like so. And you can check your transforms here. See, it's zeroed out and 1, and the origin's down there, so that's where it should be. And then all of your, you can do scene selection or use the drop down. Make sure the meshes themselves are zeroed out with a 1 scale for every single one of them. with the origin snapped where it's supposed to be. And they are. And then the armature needs a rotation on the x-axis at -90, and everything else zeroed out. And once all your objects are selected and you export correctly, then this animation will work inside of TMTK. Thing to note is that it will load into the game sideways like this, and then you will have to rotate it up in game, but you will be able to select it correctly and it will animate in game, which is the important part. Alright, so that concludes this tutorial on how to get objects to animate inside of TMTK using Blender 2.8. It's very simple. Alright, have a great day, guys. And I look forward to seeing what you create. Bye!